This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. We're very excited about this episode today. And we have some amazing news. We just hit 1.1 thousand subscribers on our channel. So if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a lot of people who have. So go and do that. Why not? You're enjoying this, aren't you? If not, I'll be very upset. So, we also started pre-recording some of our clips, which is great, but we're still live. So kind of tune in every week, Sunday, 7 p.m. UK time, and you can check when it is based on your location. Now, we can go into this week's episode. It's really, really exciting. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about Bolivia, which, whoa, what a roller coaster that was, right? So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about the US because, we can't not do that when there's an election in a few weeks. And then we're going to finish with Brexit, which I know everyone's dreading this word. No one knows what's going to happen. No one knows what it means, but we are going to make sure everyone does. So before we start, I want to say hi to my brilliant co-host, Doya. How are you doing, Doya?
I'm doing well, Yara. It's so great to see you. So I have Andre here, who is a member of the International Socialist Alternative in Brazil. How's it going, Andre?
Yeah, I'm fine. And you?
Good. Glad you could make it. So we have been following closely the situation in Bolivia. Historically, the socialist movement has oftentimes looked to Bolivia and the party MAS, which is the movement for socialism. And we had Andre here previously to speak about what was going on there, in regards to the coup. But now we saw a recent electoral victory. So Andre, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure, Toya. Well, only a few days ago, we got the final results of the elections in Bolivia. But since Monday, it was known that the MAS victory had been overwhelming. So Luis Arce Catacora and Davi Choquehuanca were elected president and vice president with 55% of the votes. And the MAS obtained a 2/3 majority in the Legislative Assembly, both in the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. In La Paz and Cochabamba, just to give you an example, Luis Arce obtained an incredible 68 and 66% of the votes, respectively. The difference in votes compared to the second place, the right-wing candidate, Carlos Mesa, was over 25%. Concerning the ultra-right-wing candidate, Luis Fernando Camacho, the difference was more than 40%. And what explains this result is the profound popular rejection of the coup d'etat promoted by these sectors of the right wing in 2019, and the catastrophic experience of almost a year of Jeanine Áñez's illegitimate government in a context of economic and social collapse and the pandemic of the new coronavirus. The 2019 coup took place in a context in which there was some political wear and tear by Evo Morales after 13 years in government, and the right-wing and imperialism used the situation to denounce an alleged electoral fraud in the elections. At that time, Evo Morales, the difference between Evo Morales and Carlos Mesa in the elections had been much smaller than now, only 10%, which is the minimum necessary to avoid a second round. So the right wing did not accept the result, and nor did they accept the realization of a second round of voting. So they choose to promote a coup and impose as president, Senador Jeanine Áñez, in a totally illegitimate manner. So the coup involved violent action in the streets by the extreme right paramilitary forces, a police riot, an ultimatum from the army command demanding the resignation of Evo Morales, and full support for the coup by the Organization of American States and US imperialism. as well as right-wing governments in the region. So the mass resistance against Jeanine Áñez and the electoral victory of the mass now shows the strength of the working class and the oppressed people in Bolivia and their struggle against all these reactionary forces. And this message has great strength, not only in Bolivia, but in all of Latin America.
It's so inspiring when the working class can, come together and fight and have a victory. But what does that mean when we say, this is basically because of the working class? Does that just mean that people got together, went out, and collectively voted for the candidate that they wanted?
Well, since the beginning, from the beginning, Jeanine Áñez's government was marked by a strong authoritarian escalation and intense repression. Dozens were killed in the process of resistance to the coup and to her government. I would like to emphasize here the massacres in Sacaba, in the region of Cochabamba, and Sencata in El Alto, just close to La Paz, promoted by the government and the armed forces. So, as was quite common in the region, Jeanine Áñez used the pandemic as a justification for further repression and to postpone the electoral process that was originally scheduled for May. In August, faced with another postponement of the elections, a strong movement against the government and for democratic and clean elections exploded. So the Central Obrera Boliviana, the COP, the Bolivian Workers' Center, and the Pact of Unity, various social movements, workers, peasants, and indigenous movements mobilized with massive assemblies, demonstrations, and more than 100 roadblocks throughout the country. So this mobilization was what prevented a new coup d'etat, a coup inside the coup, a coup within the coup. It was the direct struggles of the workers that ensured that the elections, in fact, took place without so much space for frauds and even more anti-democratic maneuvers. But this movement could indeed have gone much further than it was in reality. So in the mobilization in August, for example, the demand for the immediate overthrow of Jeanine Áñez's government was adopted by broad sectors of the movement, but this demand was not taken up by the COB leadership and was explicitly rejected by Evo Morales and the mass leadership. So overthrowing Áñez would have been very important to ensure an even more favorable balance of power for radical and profound transformations in Bolivian society. But as they have done many times in the past, the mass leadership tried to contain the radicality of the process and channel this dissatisfaction into institutional ways and keeping them under control. But there is no doubt that this mass struggle was decisive for this election result.
Yeah, and I mean, what an important lesson for us to kind of analyze. On the one hand, it's so important and great that the working masses in Bolivia were able to, defend democracy and make sure that the election happened and there was no fraud. And what that took was mass mobilization. But also, we need to be, honest with what could have happened if we had pushed the movement further. I think that's a great lesson for us to take in the socialist movement. I want to shift a little bit, though, because, over the past few decades, we've seen American imperialism, make its way throughout Central America, throughout South America. This was a defeat on American imperialism by the Bolivian working masses. Do you think that this is the beginning of the end of American imperialism?
Well, it's not the beginning of the end, but it's a very important step forward in the resistance against imperialism in general. You know that US imperialism was a protagonist in planning the 2019 coup and did everything possible to interfere in this year's election. So the US embassy in La Paz has always been an active center of conspiracy against the democratic rights of the Bolivian people. So as we explained at the time, the deeper meaning of what happened in Bolivia in 2019 can be seen in the explicit demonstration by Elon Musk, you know, the billionaire owner of Tesla company, when asked on Twitter whether the interest in Bolivian lithium was not behind the coup d'etat, he simply replied, "We will coup whoever we want, so deal with it." So it was explicitly in this message. So, but it is also important to highlight, for example, the Brazil's sub-imperialist role also concerning Bolivia, especially under the ultra-right-wing government of Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is a faithful lackey to the interests of U.S. ruling class in Latin America, and also serves the Brazilian landowners who controls large areas in eastern Bolivia and help to finance extreme right-wing groups such as the Civic Committee Pro Santa Cruz, etc. So it's true, the defeat of the right and imperialism also makes direct intervention by U.S. imperialism in Venezuela, for example, more difficult. So it's important development in the region. So in general, the defeat of the Bolivian right wing and the extreme right in these elections is also a defeat of imperialism and also Latin American right-wing governments and politicians like Bolsonaro, for example.
I see a beautiful little child back there that wants to say hello. But one last question, and then we'll let you get back to your fatherly duties. What is the effect that we're seeing throughout the entire region, throughout Latin America? And also, what do we need to keep this movement going?
Well, I think the first task for the movement at this moment is to learn the lessons of the last months. So without popular and workers' struggles in the streets, workplaces, without the mobilization of peasants, indigenous people, women, youth, there is no way to advance the conquests. The electoral victory would not have been won without the resistance against Agnes, without the roadblocks, without the struggles in the streets, despite all the difficulties, the repression, and the pandemic. We must also reject any illusion that from now on, it's enough to wait for the progressive changes through the regular institutional channels, the parliament, the action of the ministers, etc. So in a context of a deep economic and social crisis and where the pandemic is still a very serious problem, the role of the movement is to conquer, to win the achievements from the struggle, by the struggle. Otherwise, the new government will accommodate and adapt to the limits imposed by the crisis of capitalism, as, for example, we have seen from governments considered progressive, such as Alberto Fernandez in Argentina and López Obrador in Mexico. So Evo Morales recently stated that Bolivia is an example of how to promote progressive changes within capitalism, but that is an illusion. Bolivia cannot count on a new commodity boom cycle to promote some income redistribution. And we are in the middle of a global crisis of capitalism. And the only way to secure gains for the working people is to break with the logic of that system. So the workers' movement needs to take this perspective and this anti-capitalist and socialist program, even if the government does not have it independently of the new government. So Luis Arce Catacora, the new president, has made statements in defense of a reconciliation and national unity. But it's not possible to have a reconciliation and unity with the murderers of workers in Sacaba and Sencata, with who has gained millions of dollars through corruption in the purchase of health equipments during the pandemic, or with who has promoted a coup d'etat to guarantee the profits of the multinationals and landowners, etc. So the fascists and proto-fascists in Bolivia and those who support them must pay for their crimes if they are not punished, they will repeat their crimes in the future. So it is the role of the social movements to maintain a permanent mobilization for their demands and to conquer them with struggle, advancing in an anti-capitalist and socialist alternative. So this is the way for the workers in Latin America and in general as a whole. For example, you know that today, Sunday, the Chilean people are voting in the plebiscite on the new constituent process, but they are still fighting in the street for freedom for the political prisoners of the popular uprising of 1 year ago, for the right to a public pension system, for the right to public education, for women's rights, for the rights of the Mapuche people. And also in Colombia, in the same way, the struggles are advancing. We have the protest against the police violence. And also this week, we have seen the indigenous mobilizations in Bogota and other popular demonstrations. So the results of the Bolivian elections help to stimulate these struggles and influence other electoral process in several other countries. And we are entering a time of intense social and political polarization in Latin America, and the process in Bolivia are part of that. They show that it's possible to defeat the right wing in the streets and at the ballot boxes, but it's necessary to go to the ultimate consequences and defeat capitalism and build an international socialist alternative.
Thank you so much. And it's so true. The work that they've done is inspiring and all throughout Latin America. And hopefully in Brazil, that work is being inspired there as well. You have 2 campaigns that you guys are running, one in Sao Paulo, where you are. So good luck. And we will be sure to have you back on the show to talk about the results of that campaign. Thanks so much, Andre.
Thank you so much, Andre. It's always great to hear from our comrades around the world. It's really good to hear from someone who's actually in Latin America right now, and it's kind of like, can tell us so much more than the media would tell us about what's happening there. And I think, the question of Bolivia really connects well to the US because of how like the big influence of the US has in Bolivia, like we talked about. So as a token American, Toya, I'm going to ask you a few questions, if that's okay. We had a debate on Thursday. What did you say about that?
I mean, it's interesting that it's so close to the election. This is supposedly going to be the last debate. Last time Trump said he wasn't going to do a debate. So they did these like competing town halls, which it's like, you might as well just have a debate at that point. But it was really interesting to see how different it was in the way that they performed. There was rules set in place about muting the microphones, even though they didn't really actually need to do that. And they kind of talked over each other. But a couple of things stood out to me. I mean, one was the discussion around the pandemic. And, Trump was asked how he will deal with the pandemic in the coming period. And he basically backpedaled to say he did everything that he could have done. And Europe is numbers are going up in Europe as well. And, all of these things, he didn't really talk about what was needed going forward. And Biden kind of attacked him on, you had said that it would be over by Easter. You had said that it would be over by the summer. But Biden also talked about the fact that in red states, numbers are going up. And I mean, I just have to say, I live in a blue state and my city is, a Democratic mayor. And the person who asked the questions, she even commented on my city because now we're in Boston, we're closing down public schools. So it was disingenuous for Biden to say that, well, because in red states, this, trying to point the blame on the Democratic Party, when actually, the Republican Party, when actually the Democratic Party, is doing the same things. Boston and Massachusetts is a blue state and we have to close down schools again. So I think it just, it really pointed to there not being a solution. Then they talked about, not then, but also they talked about healthcare. Yara, I mean, I know it's hard for you because you don't live in a place where we have to pay for healthcare, right? And I know in Europe, you're constantly under attack. I mean, in England, constantly under attack for your nationalized healthcare. But to listen to these men talk about their solutions that they're putting forward, Trump says on the one hand, 100 million Americans love their private insurance. I have private insurance. My private insurance is good. I pay $13 an hour for my private insurance. $13 an hour. Imagine what I could buy with that. I would much prefer socialized healthcare, you know? And what's Biden's solution? Biden's solution is to have this hybrid where you have a public option for people who qualify, but also allow people to keep their private healthcare. It's just, you know, they're talking in circles, you know, from this up on their high horse. Like, it's just working people don't have all of these options that they're putting forward. So yeah, it just really points towards we need an alternative outside of the Democrats, outside of the Republicans, because it's just like this talking circle that they both go in.
I mean, obviously, when you're a billionaire, $13 an hour doesn't sound that much. But like, you know, it always struck me in those discussions because it seems so, you know, like detached from the reality that we have in Europe and even in Israel, where I'm from, when the system isn't completely socialized but semi-socialized, and but like the statement that people love the private health insurance, yeah, they do, because it's much better than not having any of it. But that's not the question, right? And I also love the numbers in Europe are rising as well, like. Oh, so like, are we gonna like look at other countries and see which one did the worst? Can't we just like find a solution and an alternative that would not kill millions of people worldwide? Like, I think that should probably be something that we push for. And like you said, it's not like we have an alternative. It's not like Biden gave maybe slightly better answers, but not a real alternative. But he's still up in the polls. So do we think it's kind of like in the bag, this deal, Biden's winning, we can all breathe comfortably, we're not going to see Trump and start like preparing for a Biden presidency, which we'll still need to fight against, but in a different way, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we can definitively say that because Biden is up in the polls that he's going to win. You know, another poll that I thought was interesting was they're saying that less people than expected who are registered Republicans are going to vote in person. Like, the number of registered Republicans that are mailing in their ballot is actually higher than previously thought. So I think on election night, it's still going to be up in the air to see how many people have mailed in their ballots. I mean, the number of people that are mailing in their ballots is like millions times more than ever before. But of course, we're still seeing, you know, all of the voter suppression, and many of these mail-in ballots aren't going to be valid because of all of these different precedents that are being set in different states. For example, in one state, they're saying that if a person didn't get their, you know, their ballot, like, you know, someone watched them sign their ballot, then it's not going to be valid. Like, all of these different little things. And so I think it's still going to be up in the air. Who's gonna win on election night.
So you think that even if, you know, Biden gets the majority of the votes, Trump is still going to try and steal this election?
I mean, well, first we have to consider it's not necessarily just the majority of the votes, right? In the US, we have this weird electoral college. So it's the majority of the votes in the certain states that are, you know, the battleground states that we call them. Trump has backpedaled a little bit on the question of stealing the election. He said some offhand comment about him maybe needing to leave the country. And I think him, you know, getting sick kind of weakened him a little bit. And he's not being as upfront about that. You know, we could see a situation maybe where he relies on the far right to kind of fight that battle for him, like in the streets, where he just claims fraud, but doesn't necessarily take the steps to steal the election. We saw in many states in the South, voters who are registered as Democrats received this email, and you know, they're saying that it was, you know, not sent by this group. It was, you know, international influence. But regardless, many registered voters received this email from this group called the Proud Boys, which is a far right group, saying that, you know, basically threatening them if they don't go and vote for Trump. So yeah, there's this like right wing that's being whipped up, and maybe Trump might, you know, he might rely on them, but I really think it's still all up in the air.
So, I mean, I think the question of the far right is really on everyone's minds right now, like not just in the US, generally around the world. But I was wondering, what do you think we should do? Like, what does socialist alternative do? What are the plans? What happens if Trump if Trump tries to steal the election? What happens if he wins? And also, what happens if Biden wins? Do we just like stop and kind of recalibrate, or are we planning to go on the streets anyway?
Yeah, so Socialist Alternative, we're planning for what Trump said. Trump said that he's going to steal the election. And so we're planning actions to say that we have to defend democracy. You know, people should be able to vote, and the person that we vote for should be elected. Although we also think that we should have more options, better options. But regardless, we can't allow for someone to come in and steal the election. But if Biden wins on election night, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be hitting the streets, because what is the Democratic Party the best at? It's quieting the social movements. You know, we call it the graveyard of social movements. They co-opt, and there is going to be, if Biden wins, this huge sigh of relief from the working class that we don't have to deal with Trump anymore. But what we're going to say on election night, if Biden wins, is what do we need to do to keep building movements, to keep the socialist movement going, to fight for the things that we need, whether that be, healthcare, education, housing, economic relief in the pandemic. What do we need to do to hold Biden accountable? There's still going to be so many unanswered questions as to if the Democrats are going to be able to get us out of this crisis. And so we want to build a movement to basically, start that process of holding those Democrats accountable.
I think if we're talking about elections, in Britain, in the UK, there was a big election last December, and it revolved pretty much exclusively around the question of Brexit. You know, it was a few years since the referendum where Brexit basically controlled the headlines. And the last few months, we saw kind of a focus on the pandemic for obvious reasons, and obviously the economic depression as well. But as negotiations for a new trade deal between the UK and the EU come to kind of like the final stages, the question of Brexit is, I guess, once again on people's minds. And I think it's also raising big questions to do with the economy, with freedom of movement, with immigration, and of course, the many national questions in both the UK and Ireland. And, for example, the big thing that happened in the last couple of months was the Internal Market Bill, which was passed last month by the UK government. And what it basically does is it allows UK law to override international treaties if they contradict it. And that breaks international law, according to the UK government, which passed the law. So that's great, right? But the whole bill stems from kind of the threats from the EU to make the passage of goods between Britain and Northern Ireland more difficult. And, if that happens, that can have real consequences for the national question in Northern Ireland. And, it's already an area with extreme sectarianism, extreme violence in the first place. So that's not going to be great. And that's, of course, going to all be in the context of the trend of deglobalization worldwide, and the question of Brexit can really have a big impact on that. And it's not just that, the economic crisis and COVID made governments around the world invest massively and spend public funds. So it also ties in with a big question of state aid that Brexit is bringing up. And, that is a massive issue with the deal between the UK and the EU. So we have Becky from the ISA section in England, Wales, and Scotland, and we've also got Kevin from the Socialist Party, which is the ISA in Ireland, to talk about this. So I want to ask you, Becky, do you think we're headed for a no-deal Brexit?
It's very possible that we could be heading for a no-deal exit. I think that it's in all sides of the capitalist class. It's in their interest to come to a deal, both in the interests of British capitalists, but also the EU. So I think probably they will come to some kind of deal. But when it's people like Boris Johnson that are involved in it, anything could happen, and he could be forced into trying to save face and refusing to accept a deal, and then Britain kind of crashing out of the EU. I think that there's been a lot of kind of obviously worry about what a no deal would mean. It's probably likely that in the event of a no deal, there would still be some kind of agreement. It would be kind of managed in some way. But really, the issue for the workers' movement is not necessarily whether there's a deal or no deal, because we understand that when it comes to the Tories and the capitalists in the EU, whatever they agree is not going to be in the interests of working class people. So it's likely that there will be anti-worker elements of any kind of deal. So for us, it's kind of, the question is, what will we need to fight, and being prepared and being ready to fight any kind of anti-worker parts of whatever gets agreed between the British government and the EU.
Thank you, Becky. And I want to ask also, what are kind of like the main big points when it comes to a deal? Why is there no deal? If the ruling class's interest is to get a deal, why do we have no deal right now?
Well, partly it's that the British capitalist class in the main didn't want Brexit to happen. They campaigned very hard during the referendum to get people to vote to remain in the EU. And then when the vote was to leave, they had to try and show that they were going to support that and that they were going to try and implement Brexit. But then also they've been trying to have it as like Brexit in name only. So there's been lots of like wings of the Tory party, sections of the capitalist class that want us to stay in the single market and in effect stay within the EU. But then there's like pressure, obviously, from people that want to leave properly, want to leave the EU. And there's not agreement in the Tory party or amongst like business owners and things like that about what kind of deal would be good. The main things that are being discussed at the minute is about fisheries, which is a big thing when it comes to the EU. It's not like a major part of British industry. Fisheries make up 0.1% of British GDP. But the reason that it's quite a big issue for Boris Johnson is that the majority of fishing towns and villages voted leave. And it was kind of people working in these types of industries that felt the strongest about leaving the EU. And so that's why they're trying to get, Boris Johnson trying to get like a good deal for Britain on that issue. The other thing is about state aid, and that's kind of related to what you were talking about, the internal market bill, because in different parts of the UK, in Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, the EU has like directly funded projects within those countries. But part of what the internal market bill is going to do is mean that funding will be controlled by Westminster. So it's actually reversing some aspects of devolution which existed. But the reason that they want to do that, the reason that Johnson and the Tory government want to do that is because firstly, Dominic Cummings, his kind of chief aide, has this dream that Britain will be able to compete with the US and China on technology. It's like very unlikely that that's going to happen, but they want this idea of being able to invest massively from the state into tech companies, British tech companies, to be able to do that. But also, with coronavirus and the stimulus packages that they're having to implement in order to try and save jobs and kind of bail out businesses to pay wages and things like that, they're going to need more freedom to be able to invest, a lot of money from the government. And then there's also the kind of political issue of Northern Ireland, but I expect we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute.
Yeah, I think if you already started that, I want to ask Kevin a little bit. So what is happening Irish border? What's going to happen with the Good Friday Agreement that kind of put an end to the active sectarianism in the country? What's going to happen with Brexit to do that?
Well, I think the Brexit process has put the question of the Irish border centre stage in a way that for 20 years they were able to avoid. Famous phrase in Northern Ireland is creative ambiguity. Both sides can pretend that they're getting what they want. But Brexit's put its centre stage on the question of having a land border with the European Union. which affected issues of customs and the single market. And the British government and the European Union have been trying to find a solution to this problem. You had a solution from Theresa May, which then Boris Johnson tore up, and he came up with the withdrawal deal, which basically meant that Britain would leave the single markets, but Northern Ireland would still be part of it, or be part of its regulations, and we'd still have a customs union with Britain. And now he effectively went and tore up his own agreements by this internal market bill, which he claims will unite the United Kingdoms, but actually is proven to be very divisive. And I think the central issue is where the border is. Is it a east-west border, as in a border in the Irish Sea, or a north-south border, as in a border in Ireland, the reinforcing of the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic? And the previous deal was opposed by Protestants because it was seen as a move towards a capitalist United Ireland, or a economic United Ireland. But what this will do is pose the question of a north-south border, which will be opposed by Catholics, who will see it as a copper fastening of partition, dividing communities. And what can happen is the British government refused to implement its agreements, or there's no agreement, and therefore it doesn't have to implement that agreement, and pressure will then come on from the European Union for a north-south border, which again can be problematic. What socialists say is that on the basis of capitalism, there is no solution to this that won't mean one community loses out over another, and we need to bring people together in common struggle on the issues that affect people. And on that basis, you can actually find a democratic solution.
Yeah, I think the questions, like national questions, are always the most, I guess, sensitive issues when we talk about any change in the political kind of organization. So I think it's always really scary, especially with like places that have an active national question that is very much violent and affecting people's lives on a daily basis. But I wanted to ask you, Kevin, about another national question in the UK, which is Scottish independence. Obviously, there was a referendum a few years ago, which ended up by a very marginal majority to stay in the UK. But now there's calls for another referendum and for Scotland to leave the UK because of Brexit. So I was wondering what's happening with that.
Well, you've seen in the recent opinion polls a clear majority, 53% for independence. One had it as high as 55%. Among young people, it is a lot higher, 79% support for independence. And the reason that you're seeing an increase of support is because, one, Brexit is causing a sense of people being left behind. Majority of people in Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, and they believe they're being forced out against their will. But also COVID is exacerbating it with a sense that the Boris Johnson is, failing to look after people in Scotland, and it comes after years and decades of austerity of right-wing governments that people in Scotland see as not in their interests. And you have the problem, basically, that a majority of people will want independence. They will have the Scottish Nationalist Party. It will have has a strong base in Westminster because of that. Will be re-elected probably in the 2021 elections. But the British government will say that you've already had your shot at the cherry, and they'll say that it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And basically, if you can have an important clash like happened in Catalonia, where people have to organize themselves to take action to fight for their democratic rights and put pressure on the Scottish government in that regard.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's like, you know, Brexit is such a big question in the UK, but also internationally. And I think seeing what happens with the different kind of nations in the UK is really interesting. And also, you know, it's kind of hanging in the air right now. We don't really know what's going to happen. We don't know what kind of response it will get after Brexit is finalized. We don't know what's going to happen, if there's a deal, if there's no deal, what kind of deal. Before I ask about kind of what we think is going to happen and what we think should happen, I want to ask Becky. It's not really to do with Brexit, but I think if we already have you here, there's a lot of interesting things happening in Manchester at the moment with COVID, and I was wondering if you can explain to us a little bit about what's going on. Why is it in the news right now?
Yeah, what's happening in Manchester is quite exciting. What we've had is the Tory government imposing further lockdown restrictions on different areas of the country, but without adequate support for the businesses and workers that are going to be closing, or people that are going to be losing their jobs or not receiving their full pay and things like that. And this is the only place where there's been resistance to that. And the mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has refused to accept it. There's been some negotiations where they put, you know, Greater Manchester put forward what sort of money would be needed in order to defend jobs and pay people properly. And the government refused that. And there's been, you know, a battle really between the two. But it's kind of resulted in mass support from people in Greater Manchester for the stand that Andy Burnham has taken. And this is significant in lots of different ways. It's one of the only kind of resistances that we've had to COVID and the way in which the government's been handling the situation. But it's also significant in the Labour Party as well. Andy Burnham is a member of the Labour Party, but the national leader, Keir Starmer, has been completely silent on this issue, and it's raising lots of questions about kind of what direction the Labour Party is going in and things like that. But importantly for us, we can't kind of have illusions that somebody like Andy Burnham, who was health secretary under Tony Blair, was responsible for privatisation of the health service, has been closing fire services and so on in Greater Manchester. We can't, you know, trust that he's going to give a good lead to this movement. So we're kind of calling for the trade union movement and the people that are angry to kind of raise demands for 100% pay for people that are having to, you know, not work in the second lockdown, but also importantly for workers' control over deciding whether businesses and workplaces should be open or not, and workers' control over health and safety measures. So these issues are right at the forefront of this kind of uprising, which is very significant, but we'll have to see kind of which way it goes.
Thank you, Becky. I think this, you know, the whole thing that's happening with COVID right now is affecting everything, including Brexit, so much. And I want to ask you, Kevin, what do you think is going to happen, and why do we support Brexit? And do we support a no-deal Brexit? How, like, what is the socialist response to this question?
Okay, so I think what is the starting point for us is that neither side in these negotiations represent the interest of working class people. It's relatively obvious that the Tories don't, but neither does the European Union, which has been an institution responsible for waging war against workers in Greece and Spain and Italy, but also right across the European Union. It's been responsible for a program of militarization and a program of attacking refugees. So nobody represents the interest of working class people in these negotiations. And the key point for socialists is to argue that whether it be a no-deal Brexit, a deal, or if sections of the establishment had got what they want, staying in the European Union, that means attacks on working class people. including in the form of a trade agreement between the UK and the US, which would bring in a tax on working class workers' conditions, and particularly on the NHS. And so I think we also have to make the point that we're not nationalists, we're internationalists. We favour unity of working class people across Europe. You can see how that's possible when you see struggles of workers in the health service, be it in Britain, in Belgium, Spain, elsewhere, how they have a common struggle. And so what socialists pose is the need for a different type of Europe, one that is run in the interest of the millions and not the billionaires, which is the institutions we have, be it in Westminster or in Brussels at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kevin and Becky. I think this really kind of explains the very difficult and complicated question of Brexit. So thank you for kind of enlightening us. And I think it's going to be really helpful to everyone around the world who has been really confused about this question. And now we're going to go to the shout out of the week. So who are we talking about today, Toya?
Today, I'm really excited to talk about the youth in Ireland who have started Youth Against Racism and Inequalities. It's an anti-racist, anti-capital campaign started because of the historic global movement, Black Lives Matter. And, young people especially have made it very clear that they are ready for a change and they are willing to fight for it. Young people, we can't forget, play an important role in our world, especially since they're the future members of the working class. So this movement of students and young people in Ireland is saying that they are tired of the status quo and the austerity and the cuts, but especially they are tired of the brutalities of capitalism that disproportionately affect people of color, immigrants and refugees, and Irish travelers. So they're calling for the money that has been spent on things like deportations to be spent on healthcare and housing and better wages for the working class, but especially those that deal with things like racist and xenophobic policies that are creating these divisions that we're seeing in society. They're also speaking out against what's happening in Nigeria. As we saw, there was a brutal massacre by the police on protesters. And so solidarity to everyone who's fighting back there. But last Friday, Youth Against Racism and Inequality held a day of action in Dublin where school children and college students held protests and rallies at their schools. And this is an exciting and growing movement in Ireland. So we want to shout out the work of the International Socialist Alternative there. In Ireland, we're called the Socialist Party. And so if you are in Ireland and you want to get involved with Youth Against Racism and Inequality or the Socialist Party, please click the link below. As always, it's inspiring to see young people getting active. So great job to the Irish youth. I want to take this moment to thank everyone who participated with us today. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. And see you next time, same place.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!